They didn't just lose control of you. They lost access to your soul. And the terrifying truth for the narcissist is this: you didn't scream. You didn't fight. You didn't even say goodbye. You just became free. This isn't just emotional survival. This is a spiritual victory. And here's what most people don't know. By the time you finally realize you've defeated them, the narcissist already knew it. That's why they've been unraveling in silence. If you've ever asked, did I actually overcome what they did to me? This message is your answer. Because there are 5 signs that reveal you've not only escaped their manipulation, you've spiritually conquered the entire system they tried to trap you in. Let's walk through these signs together, not just as survivors, but as sons and daughters of the Most High God. Because the battle wasn't only psychological, it was sacred. 1. Your silence has become their loudest nightmare. There is a kind of silence that does not come from fear, defeat, or weakness. It is not the cold silence of resentment. It is not the manipulative silence they once used to punish you. No, this silence is holy. This silence is proof that God has already moved you beyond the reach of their voice. When you were still under their influence, your world was noisy, full of self-doubt, constant explanations, emotional exhaustion. Every word felt like a negotiation for worth. Every conversation was a battlefield where you tried to defend your heart, only to be made the villain in their twisted version of reality. They didn't want your truth. They wanted your confusion, because confusion kept you stuck, and chaos made them feel like gods. And you, being the soul you are, kind, loyal, hopeful, kept believing that maybe if you just said the right thing, if you just explained your heart a little better, if you just prayed harder, maybe they'd finally see the truth. But they never did. They weren't listening. They never were. And slowly, painfully, God opened your eyes to a truth you didn't want to admit. You were speaking life to someone who only knew how to breathe in pain. And so, one day it stopped. Not in a dramatic explosion, not with a final confrontation, but quietly, gracefully, eternally. You stopped arguing. You stopped chasing. You stopped handing your sacred energy to someone who only used it to wound you deeper. And in that stillness, you weren't shutting them out. You were letting God in. That was the moment everything changed. To them it felt like abandonment. To you it felt like resurrection. They called it giving up, but heaven called it stepping out. And now, this silence they mocked, this silence they thought was weakness, is suffocating them, because they finally realize what they never believed was possible. You're no longer available, not physically, not emotionally, not spiritually. You are no longer trying to prove your value to someone who made a sport out of devaluing you. You are no longer explaining your worth to someone who twisted every truth. You are no longer debating your intentions with someone who never came to understand, only to dominate. Your silence is not empty. It is sacred space filled with wisdom, discernment, and spiritual clarity. It is the shelter where your healing took root. It is the altar where you laid down every weight they put on you and picked up the armor of God. It is not just the absence of noise. It is the presence of peace. And peace is what narcissists cannot tolerate. Because peace is immune to manipulation. They thrived on your reaction. They needed your tears to feel powerful, your anger to feel pursued, your confusion to feel needed. And now, all they hear is silence. Not the kind of silence that waits for retaliation, but the kind that says, "You have no place here anymore." And here's what they'll never say aloud, but know with certainty deep inside: they lost. They lost not because you fought harder, but because you stopped playing their game, as you left the arena entirely. When God removes you from the cycle of pain, He doesn't ask for your permission. He simply lifts you out of it and gives you peace that passes all understanding. That's what this silence is. It is the sound of your elevation, the echo of your deliverance. They don't know what to do with it, because your silence tells a story they cannot rewrite. It reflects a freedom they cannot imitate. It speaks a language their deception cannot interpret. And so they rage, or they play victim, or they wait, thinking maybe one day you'll return to the old dynamic. But you never do. Because what God severs in the spirit, no human drama can revive. That is why your silence is not passive. It is powerful. It's not avoidance. It's authority. It's the sound of chains breaking. To you, it may have just felt like a boundary, but to them, it was a funeral. Not for your relationship, but for their illusion of control. And when someone has built their entire identity around the idea that they can dominate you emotionally, that kind of loss is unbearable. You didn't scream. You didn't beg. You didn't announce your exit. You just became free. And that's what makes your silence so loud. Not in volume, but in truth. Because silence is the final word of someone who's been vindicated by heaven. And to the narcissist, that's the one sound they can't twist, can't answer, and can't survive. 2. Their hoovering attempts fall completely flat. They never expected to lose you like this. Not with a slammed door, not with anger, but with silence, with peace, with nothing left to say. You see, narcissists never believe you're really gone. To them, people are not people. They're resources, extensions, puppets. And when a narcissist notices the distance growing, when the supply begins to dry up, they don't grieve, they calculate. They begin hoovering, just like a vacuum, trying to suck you back into the cycle they built to keep you small. It always starts subtle. A checking-in message, a vague compliment, a memory from the past that they hope still lives in your heart. If that doesn't work, they go spiritual. They'll say, "God's been convicting me," or "I had a dream about you." They might even throw in verses, act vulnerable, or share a fake testimony. It's not repentance, it's manipulation disguised as revelation. And once upon a time, those tricks might have worked. Once upon a time, your heart still longed for restoration, still prayed for them, still believed they were capable of real change. Once upon a time, you would have stared at the message for hours, pacing, praying, wondering, is this it? Is this finally the change I've been waiting for? But not anymore, because this time their message hits a different version of you. A version that no longer flinches at their name. A version that doesn't need an apology to find peace. A version that doesn't long for reconciliation with someone God already removed from your life. This time, when the narcissist reaches, they reach into a void. They touch nothing. And that nothing That's everything. You are not cold. You are not bitter. You are not numb. You are healed. And healed people do not respond to chaos. Healed people do not feel obligated to offer closure to someone who never offered clarity. Healed people do not run back to the arms that once strangled their voice. When God heals deeply, it's not that you forget the pain. It's that the pain no longer governs your response. And that is what terrifies them. Not your silence, not your strength, but the fact that they no longer occupy your mind. The fact that their opinion no longer affects your choices. The fact that you could receive their most carefully scripted message and feel absolutely nothing. Not curiosity, not guilt, not nostalgia, just the quiet conviction that what they lost in you can never be regained. Because you were not just a partner, you were not just a friend, you were a mirror, a source, a soul who poured into them, listened to them, carried their burdens, excused their outbursts, made space for their brokenness again and again. And yet for a moment you are about to sag, unconsciously. And now, that mirror no longer reflects them. That source no longer flows in their direction. That soul has been hidden in Christ. The narcissist does not miss you. They miss access. They miss the energy. They miss the soft landing. They miss the person who absorbed their cruelty and still offered kindness. What they mourn is not your presence, but their loss of control over your spirit. And when they try to return, expecting a reaction, expecting a door to be cracked open, expecting some emotional residue to give them a foothold, what they encounter is the one thing they never imagined they'd face: closure without their consent. You didn't ghost them. You didn't block them out of vengeance. You simply evolved past the version of yourself that would have ever answered. You moved forward. You rose. You outgrew their chaos like a tree that no longer fits the small pot it was planted in. And they feel it, even through the silence, even in your absence. They feel the weight of their own words falling flat. They sense that what used to be a guaranteed response has turned into an immovable stillness. And to someone whose identity was built entirely on provoking emotions, they experience your peace as a form of psychological death. They may act unbothered. They may mock your boundaries. They may even increase the pressure, switching between pity and rage, God talk and gaslighting, hoping something will trigger you back into reaction. But it's too late, because what they don't realize is that God has already answered the question for you. The long nights where you begged, "Should I go back?" The gut-wrenching grief that made you wonder if you were giving up too soon. The prayers for signs. The silence that made you question if you were hard-hearted. All of that was part of the breaking, and from the breaking came your deliverance. The Lord didn't just remove the narcissist from your life. He removed the version of you that would be vulnerable to them ever again. And that's why their hoovering now feels so small, because you're no longer standing in that old identity. You're not the person who needed their love to feel whole. You're not the person who would trade your peace for temporary validation. You are walking in a space they cannot enter, a space built by grace, protected by discernment, and sustained by the Holy Spirit. So let them reach, let them bait, let them cry. It's over. Not because you hate them, not because you're proving a point, but because God has made it clear. You don't belong in that wilderness anymore. You're in Canaan now, and nothing that belonged to Egypt is coming with you. If this truth hits something sacred in you, don't let it fade. Let both heaven and darkness know you're not going back to what God has already brought you out of. Comment below with the words, "I'm not going back," because what God delivers you from, hell no longer has permission to touch. 3. They become invisible in your mind. There is a kind of healing that is not loud. It does not announce itself with milestones or declarations. It does not arrive with a final goodbye or a great closure. It happens slowly, quietly, invisibly, until one day you realize something sacred. You haven't thought about them in days, maybe even weeks. You didn't try to forget them. You didn't force yourself to stop caring. You simply stopped noticing. Their name no longer loops in your inner dialogue. Their face doesn't flash across your memory when you hear a familiar song. You're not rehearsing old conversations in the shower or waking up in the middle of the night wondering if they're thinking about you. They're just not there. And that absence isn't numbness. It's freedom. For so long, they occupied space in your mind they never earned. They lived in your thoughts, not because they deserved that attention, but because their manipulation made them feel inevitable. You replayed their words, trying to decode what was real and what was twisted. You analyzed their silence like it held some great mystery. You looked for meaning in their contradictions, trying to make sense of chaos disguised as connection. But now you realize their absence is not something you have to maintain. It is something God Himself established. You no longer have to block their name or delete their photos to avoid a trigger, because the trigger is gone. The emotional hook has rusted and fallen out of your soul. This is not repression. This is not avoidance. This is what happens when healing becomes complete in the mind. You have been reoccupied by truth, by peace, by the voice of God, now uninterrupted by the echoes of someone who once distorted everything. There was a time when they were in every corner of your mental space. Every decision you made passed through the filter of their likely reaction. Even after they were physically gone, you still carried the invisible weight of their judgment. You still scanned your memories for their approval, even when your present no longer included them. But now you are no longer in that prison. The bars were not broken by logic or effort. They were melted by the fire of grace. The narcissist didn't leave your mind because you closed the door. They disappeared because your spirit stopped feeding the illusion that they mattered. And this vanishing is different than avoidance. Avoidance still requires effort. But this is rest. This is what it feels like when your mind becomes a sanctuary again, when your thoughts are no longer polluted by flashbacks or haunted by imaginary reconciliations. They have become psychologically invisible, not because you forced them out, but because they have no place in who you are now. And here's the truth that few people ever say out loud: the narcissist knows. Even from a distance, even if months or years have passed, they sense it. They feel the silence in your spirit. They can no longer hear the echo of their name in your tone. They know the narrative they once controlled is no longer being written with your ink. The mirror they used to gaze into, your attention, your reaction, your mental energy, is gone. And without that mirror, they lose sight of themselves. This is the moment they spiral. Not because you cut them off physically, but because they are no longer alive inside your mind. They were never truly interested in your heart. It was your focus they fed on. It was your mental space they colonized, twisting every memory, every interaction into something they could control. That's why they fought so hard to stay in your thoughts, even through absence. That's why they planted words meant to live in your subconscious. That's why they left you tangled in unfinished sentences and half answers, because confusion keeps people remembering. But not anymore. You are no longer confused. You are no longer wondering. You are no longer editing your past to excuse their presence. You are thinking clearly. You are choosing your thoughts intentionally. You are worshipping, praying, building, resting, without interruption. They are no longer in your life. They are no longer in your awareness. And that is the kind of deliverance only God can create. This isn't about forgetting. It's about no longer carrying. You didn't erase them out of bitterness. You were lifted into a level of peace where their image could not survive. They have no authority in the temple of your thoughts anymore. You are no longer tormented by what if. You are no longer tracking who they're with, what they're doing, if they miss you. Because even if they screamed your name, it would bounce off the walls of a mind that is no longer available. The narcissist is not dead, but they are invisible. Not because they disappeared from the earth, but because God erased them from the parts of you they used to haunt. And that is what real, complete freedom looks like. Not just in your heart, but in your mind. 4. Their smear campaign becomes meaningless. The narcissist doesn't stop when they lose access to your heart. They don't stop when you go silent. They don't stop when you walk away. In fact, for many of them, that's when the real war begins. Not with you directly, but with the people around you. Because if they can't control how you feel anymore, they'll try to control how others see you. They start slowly, carefully. A whispered word here, a vague accusation there. We just grew apart. She changed. He wasn't who I thought he was. They bait sympathy, pulling at the insecurities of others, knowing that subtle poison always spreads faster than overt attacks. Their goal isn't just to speak against you. It's to redefine you in the minds of others. And often, at first, it works.